I got an idea for a fun, quick, relatively easy VFX project I could do right here in my office with just my phone, my old 2015 MacBook Pro, and some great free software. Now, I'm a mid-experienced generalist when it comes to VFX, so I can do a lot of different stuff, but I'm not great at any one particular thing. So I used a lot of tutorials to get this project done, and I'll link them below, but this video is not so much a step-by-step. It's more about how I saw my creative ideas through my own little pipeline and about the overall process of getting the shot done. So this is my tiny Orc Invasion generalist VFX process. Mid-morning, this room has nice ambient light levels, but with strong directional shadows, which will be key to selling the realism of the CG elements. I placed some familiar objects around my beautiful Minus Morgul miniature from Weta Workshop to help the viewer quickly pick up a sense of scale. Filmic Pro is pretty much the gold standard for video recording on iOS. I locked off exposure, focus, and white balance since I want to simulate those in the edit. It took a bit of practice to get the whip pan just right. I needed it to settle quickly so I could get a good camera solve on the earliest frame possible to help sell the conceit that the POV actually recorded tiny orcs with a phone. Polycam uses the iPhone's lidar to scan objects so that you can import them into a DCC like Blender. I didn't need the scan itself in the final render, but it served three other purposes: to act as a shadow catcher, to serve as a transmission node that affects the color of bounced light in the final render, and finally to help me position elements in 3 space. In Blender, I started a VFX project, imported the take I liked best, and set the start frame to the earliest frame possible after the whip. With a couple tweaks, the blurry footage tracking preset does a great job of finding track points in phone video, which means I didn't have to spend a lot of time placing markers on set. One forward and backward pass gave me more than enough track channels for a good camera solve. The last setting was the 26mm focal length of the iPhone. I ran a solve, got an error score under 1, which is fine, but Blender can also clean up bad tracking channels automatically. That got me a slightly better score. Now to test the solve, I placed simple geometry on the virtual markers while the sequence ran to confirm that it was all convincingly sticking to the plate. I brought in the lidar data, just did a little bit of rough cleanup. Then I sized and positioned it to match the markers provided by the camera solve. Next, it was off to the internet to download some assets. CG Trader had a free, nice, rugged, orky-looking boat and an orc creature model that had more than enough detail for the tiny orcs. And Polyhaven had a free HDRI of this studio filled with natural light that looked like it had perfectly matched my plate. A tiny ore was no match for my limited modeling talent, so I built one and gave it a vaguely woody-looking noise shader. I made separate importable asset files for the boat and the 2 types of orcs that I'd need. Blender's Node Wrangler add-on made it quick to put together principled shaders from those downloaded textures. The boat only needed the 1 shader, and the artist who made the orc split it nicely into separate costume and creature parts, so setting up those 2 shaders was easy. I made this kind of pared down orc torso for the boats, since there's going to be 24 of them, and I want to keep the poly count as low as possible for my old computer. I set the origin to the bottom so I could apply rotational noise at one point and get random looking motion from this whole bunch of orcs instead of having to keyframe it all. I went into each orc and varied their scales, intending to make local tweaks once I had the final scene. Blender's graph editor has a noise generator that allows you to adjust scale, strength, offset, and phase. This is how I used all those origin points to assign random motion to all 24 of the orcs without individual keyframing. I also used this technique to make the actual boats appear to float. Now at this tiny scale, I can be super rough with oar placement. We don't need the orcs to be actually holding the oars. I just needed to find a rough position where the oars could convincingly reach the water, and then set the rotational origin to the point where the oar intersects the boat. Setting raw rotation keys always gets weird, so I added these big nulls and used a track 2 constraint to them on the oars. Animating the positions of the nulls was totally predictable and made it possible to get exactly the motion I wanted. I wanted this hero orc to be standing on the bridge, kind of waving his friends in. Blender's default humanoid armature was fine for this. I removed a bunch of the bones I wouldn't need and did a rough position in bind. There was a little bit of weirdness with the default bind that I had to go in and clean up, but I actually left it pretty rough because, again, at this tiny scale, you can't see any of those artifacts, so cleaning them up is not a good use of time. So all I needed was to be able to move the head and the hips and have some bendable knees and animate a rough approximation of a wave and a cheer. The lidar geometry came in handy for this next bit. I wanted to draw motion paths for the boats to follow, and having the geometry there for reference made that easy. I was then free to focus on the shapes of the motion paths and the velocity along them, and how that motion made me feel. I think this came out adorably menacing. Now that the orcs are all in the same scene, I made the overall motion more organic by going into each orc and adjusting the rotational noise offset and varying their scale. Eyeballing the hero orc puppet's scale and position against the lidar was easy, so then I just focused on the fun of animating the cheering and waving until it felt right. Now, these tiny orcs are still way too big for the scale of this miniature, but I like the idea that they kind of don't care. They're all about invading something, not being comfortable there. After a couple hours playing with all that motion, I had a viewport render that looked great. I pulled in the Studio HDRI I downloaded to see how the puppets looked, and it was surprising. It took just a few tweaks to get them looking like they actually matched the plate. The light bouncing off of the lidar scan looked fine, but I needed to make some local mesh adjustments to get the shadow positions right. It became clear I wouldn't need any additional ambient lighting at all. All I'd need is to place a directional sunlight to get the shadows to the exact orientation they are in the plate. I set up separate passes for transmission and gloss, and that allowed me in the compositing node network to add just a couple simple tweaks to individually control gloss and bounce. I noticed a happy accident at this point. The oars were clipping the invisible lidar geometry, and so it looked like they were dipping into the water on the plate. Awesome. My test renders looked good, but I wanted to simulate phone zoom halfway through with an exaggerated tilt shift effect. The free edition of Resolve doesn't support tilt shift, so I did it in Blender's built-in video editor with a mask and the Gaussian blur modifier. Once everything was rendered, I set up a project in DaVinci Resolve. I imported the renders and lined up the plate, the final render, and the tilt shift render, and then started work on simulating all the mobile phone artifacts. Here I'm simulating a quick phone zoom using basic transform keys in Resolve. The free edition of Resolve doesn't support motion blur for these keys, but it's not really noticeable. Resolve has excellent grading tools which are fully animatable. I only needed to animate the gain to simulate the POV's phone encountering bright light and adjusting the exposure automatically. There was some distracting variation in overall brightness throughout the shot. At first I thought this would be fine, but after stepping away and coming back, I found it distracting. I did a quick grading pass to make the brightness consistent throughout the shot, except for the exposure simulation. And as a viewer, I found that much simpler to visually understand. I wanted the audio to sound small, so instead of finding a huge river sound for the Morgulduin, I started with wild sound of a creek I recorded for another project. Then I went to Pond 5 to see if they had any orc vocalizations. They had a crowd sound I liked, and I found an orc cheer I thought would be cute for the hero orc. I had this funny idea that the film score follows them around, so I tried that out too. I started by laying out all the audio tracks and then keyframing volume and pan to the visual action. So when the POV is turned away from the orcs, we pan left and go quiet. And when the POV faces the orcs and zooms in, we center pan and go loud. To make it all sound small, I added some pitch shifting, rolled the bottom end off, and found places around the spectrum to bump on the different tracks for a tiny sound, but also keeping the crowd and the hero orc separate in the sound spectrum. It took a bit of playing to get the score to live around that same frequency range as all the other orc sounds without stepping on them, but I found this distortion effect that gave me the separation I needed, and that got me there. After a couple more hours of obsessive tweaks and failed dead ends, I had a shot that I liked, so it was time to output a master. I used the VFX programmer's secret sauce, FFmpeg, to generate tiny, beautiful MP4s and animated GIFs from the master. And here it is. All that work for, 5 seconds of middling entertainment? So that was my little pipeline for the tiny orcs. Be sure to check out the links below to the fantastic tutorials and assets I used in this project. Thanks for watching.